All right, on to our second of the four carbon-based molecules of life. This one is known as lipids. So lipids are also often referred to as fats. They are nonpolar molecules, so they don't have any kind of polar region to them. They don't have any charge. And because of that, they don't like being in water. So they are known as hydrophobic, so basically afraid of water. Okay. Common examples are fats, oils, and cholesterol, so you'll see those a lot with lipids. Many contain carbon chains that are called fatty acids. Okay, so these are just long carbon chains that are all bonded together. Now, lipids can have up to 3 fatty acid chains, okay, which is why they're called triglycerides as well. So, they bind these fatty acid tails to what's known as a glycerol. So this is a glycerol molecule. Okay, so you can see that you have the 3 carbons. It is a 3-carbon chain, okay, with the 3 oxygens bonded, 1 to each carbon. Now, when these fatty acid tails come in, they will actually kick this hydrogen off and then bind to the oxygen. Okay, so this is another compound you see that has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and every once in a while you'll get a phosphorus in there as well. Okay? So, these will form triglycerides. Tri meaning 3, so it has the 3 fatty acid tails. Glyceride referring to the glycerol. So in this image here, the glycerol is shown as this orange bar. And then each of the fatty acids are these kind of zigzag lines. Okay? The fatty acids don't necessarily have to be the same length as all of the ones bonded together. They don't have to basically go in the same direction. In fact, they usually don't. And then you can actually toss in some double bonds in there too, which causes some weird stuff to happen with these lipids. Okay? So lipids have several functions. They can be broken down as a source of energy. They are the body's preferred long-term storage of lipids. They actually store more energy than carbohydrates, but they're a little bit more difficult to break down. So the body doesn't necessarily like to have to go to the lipids. It will preferentially go for carbohydrates and break those down for energy all day. But the lipids are, if basically your body has excess energy, it starts to store that energy as a lipid. Okay, it's kind of like if you think about a bear bulking up for winter. Okay, so they will eat a lot of food to put on a lot of weight. That weight is stored as lipids in the bear. Okay, so then when the bear is hibernating for several months over the winter time, then its body is slowly going through that lipid storage. Okay, breaking that down, releasing that energy so that it can keep the bear alive. Right? They also can make up cell membranes. So again, we're going to get more into this once we get to our organelles chapter, but there is a specific type of specific type of lipid that we'll talk about in just a little bit that makes up those membranes. Okay, so this is actually a view of a membrane. So you have some cholesterol that you can see that's kind of fit into the membrane. You have your lipids here. Okay, so this is the glyceride, or the glycerol, okay, would be about here. And then you've got your fatty acid tails coming off of it. You also have proteins, which we'll talk about in the next section, and then different channels. So all of this has a very specific use or very specific purpose to the cell. And again, we're going to get more into that, more in depth into that when we start talking about animal and plant cells. Okay. The lipids can also be used to make hormones. Now, you might not think of hormones necessarily as a good thing, but they actually control a lot that goes on in your body. And if you didn't have hormones, I mean, you'd be stuck in adolescence forever, if even that. Okay, so hormones are actually a really good thing. Lipids generally serve as the precursors to those hormones when your body is trying to make them. Okay. So fats and oils actually have different types of fatty acids. It's why fats are generally found as a solid at room temperature and oils are generally liquid at room temperature. So saturated fatty acids have as many hydrogens as can fit. So you're not going to see any carbon-to-carbon double or triple bonds. Okay, so they're saturated, they're full of hydrogens. All right, so these ones can actually pack those fatty acid tails really close together. And so you can get a bunch of different lipids like right on top of each other because it can all pack in really tightly. So those are the fats, okay? Those are the ones that are going to be solid at room temperature. Now, for the ones that are liquid at room temperature, you have the unsaturated fatty acids, okay? So this is looking at a saturated fatty acid here. So this is just looking at the fatty acid tail. This is not looking at the triglyceride or the lipid itself, okay? Because you can tell you don't have a glycerol bonded over here, okay? But here you have all single carbon-to-carbon bonds, okay? So that actually forms a relatively straight chain. I know it doesn't necessarily look like that here, but it is a relatively straight chain, so it's easy to fit things on top of each other, okay? Now, with an unsaturated fatty acid, you're going to have at least one carbon-to-carbon double or triple bond, okay? So you can see them here. Now, again, this is not necessarily showing how this lays out when you actually have the molecule itself, but these double or triple bonds between the carbons actually produce what are called kinks in the fatty acid tail. Stop laughing. I'm looking at certain people. Anyway, okay, they produce kinks or little turns in the fatty acid tails. So that prevents different fatty acids from like stacking on top of each other, okay? So they will not form those nice solids that you see with the saturated fatty acids. These will actually be liquid at room temperature, okay? All right, and then the special type of lipid that we talk about for cell membranes is known as a phospholipid. So phospho actually comes from the phosphate group that gets attached to it. And phosphate group, if you remember from physical science, phosphate group is PO4 3-. So the phosphate group is actually charged, and it is known as the polar phosphate head on this, okay? So this actually adds in a polar region on these lipids. So now part of the lipid is still going to be hydrophobic. It doesn't want to be next to any polar compound like water. But now the phosphate group on these phospholipids is going to want to be next to water. Okay, so it produces this very different chemical makeup on the different parts of the phospholipid. And then you also have your nonpolar fatty acid tails. Okay, so you have the polar region on one end, and then the entire rest of the molecule is going to be nonpolar. And this is what it looks like. Okay, so you have your glycerol right here, but it kicks off one of its fatty acid tails and binds the phosphate group instead. Okay, and then that phosphate group tries to get as far away from these fatty acid nonpolar tails as it can, so it kind of ends up as like a little knob on the top, right? So it sticks out from the glycerol here. So with this, you're going to have this one side will interact with water just fine, and then this entire rest of the molecule will not. It likes to react only with other fatty acid tails. Okay? And you'll see why that becomes really important when we get to the cell membrane. Right? But I believe that is it for this section. So you've got carbohydrates and lipids, and in the next section we're going to talk about proteins and nucleic acids.